Joining us now, the editor of the S&A Global Contrarian, Kim Iskyan. Kim, welcome back to America's Forum.
Thanks. How are you?
We're doing fine. We appreciate you Skyping in. And Kim, we've talked about the Ukraine. What does all the unrest or even these referenda in the Ukraine portend for the Russian markets, and how will it affect U.S. markets?
Well, I think what it means for Russian markets is that this discount of the Russian stock market to the rest of the world that you just described, that's going to be there for a long time. It's been there for a long time, ever since, for the past 15 years, pretty much. And that's been largely due to political risk and the uncertainty of what Russia is really all about. Now, a lot of people, myself included, for a long time made a living out of trying to convince investors that over time this discount would contract because Russia was actually joining the ranks of the rest of the world. It was becoming further integrated into the global economy. I think what's happened in the past few months with what's happened in Crimea and Ukraine is that Russia's actually shown that it's not like the rest of the world. It really is, in many ways, an aggressor. It actually is a place that can't really be trusted with your money. You could say, well, what the government does is different from what companies do. And I'd say yes, but still those companies are located in Russia. And you can have very strong companies and very good corporate governance, but still within the macro context, it's a pretty difficult thing.
Kim, how would you say that trade within the Ukraine has been affected by the withdrawal of trade credit and political risk insurance?
Well, my sense is that Ukrainian companies are quite reliant on that sort of thing, and I wouldn't know what the short-term impact has been, but something like that could really cripple the Ukrainian economy, which the IMF says that the Ukrainian economy is going to collapse or contract by 5% this year. I think that's probably going to turn out to be an optimistic figure.
Now, it's been fascinating to watch this, Kim, and there's a geopolitical element to this where obviously there are economic implications. And I'm just curious, how long a window does Vladimir Putin have to do this continued expansion, for lack of a better term, now into the Ukraine, before the economic implications really start to hit him and he's forced to back off? Is there an element of weeks or months, or does he, for all intents and purposes, have years to continue with this kind of activity?
See, I think that sanctions, as they've been so far, don't really have that much of an impact on Russia. And I think it's important to remember that Ukraine is a red light kind of line in the sand issue for Russia. Ukraine is, in some ways, the last bastion of the last buffer between Russia and Europe. And if I'm Vladimir Putin, I've watched as the EU and as NATO have slowly encroached upon my former sphere of influence. That is everything that's behind the Iron Curtain. And Ukraine borders Russia. So if Ukraine goes west, so to speak, then you have the West right on Russia's doorstep. So that's a long way of saying that I think Russia is willing to endure, and Vladimir Putin is willing to endure a lot of pain before he pulls back. And really sanctions so far haven't been very much, and I don't think they will be very much because there's just not that political will in the US and certainly in Europe.
Kim, what's happening in the banking sector? Could we see a collapse here in the Ukraine?
Well, I think the banking sector in Ukraine has been pretty wobbly for a long time. And I think that, yes, with everything that's going on and all the uncertainty there, I think it wouldn't be surprising to me if the balance sheets of a lot of banks are in terrible shape. Any sort of Western credits they have will become incredibly difficult to pay back with the depreciation of the hryvnia, and I think it's just going to get worse.
Hey, Kim, we so often talk about the Fed in this country and continuing in the vein of banking, what's going on with the prime rates. Now, something else I'd like to really get your perspective on and amplify a little bit. With the Russian equivalent of the Fed, their central bank, taking interest rates from 1.5% to 7% to hold the line on the valuation of the ruble, what implication does that have, not only for international investors, but for the Russian Federation and an economy that, let's face it, in the transition from the Soviet Union to what we thought might end up being a free market economy that has basically taken a detour into a kleptocracy. What does this mean for the average Russian consumer, and does it even figure into Putin's political calculations?
Well, I think the hike in interest rates, yeah, I think it was by 1.5 percentage points to 7%, or right around there. You're right. I think that doesn't really figure in a whole lot. What it does do, it makes mortgages more expensive. It makes it more expensive for firms to borrow from domestic banks. That obviously does hurt the economy, because if you don't have lending growth, it's pretty hard to fuel economic growth. When you look at Vladimir Putin's approval ratings, they've always been very high. That's something that I think a lot of people in the West tend to forget, that even at his least popular, Vladimir Putin had popularity ratings that pretty much any Western leader would die for, in around 60, 65%. Now they've gone up to 80% plus. So the Vladimir Vladimirovich on the street, so to speak, he's not really caring a whole lot. So he can't buy a refrigerator on credit. It's not the end of the world. So I think that for average Russians, it'll be a while before the implications of those sanctions really hit.
Kim, would you say Russia's now an example of an emerging market in decline?
I think that a lot of people would say that Russia's been an example of an emerging market in decline for a long time. What sets Russia apart from a lot of other emerging markets is that it is almost entirely natural resources focused. And that's a huge asset base that's being slowly run down. And the Russian economy has not been very successful in diversifying. I think that this process could take generations. So I think that to write Russia off today would be a big mistake, because it is enormously wealthy. Its foreign reserves are huge. It will maybe not continue to grow at 7% a year like it was 10 years ago, but it will continue to be very wealthy, and certainly a big factor. If you're looking for growth as an investor, it's probably not the best place.
Kim, let me come back to something, because in this country, we so often measure consumer attitudes and how people are feeling here about confidence in the economy. But as you just went through the public opinion ratings for Vladimir Putin in Russia, and I realize stereotyping is dangerous, and yet if there's been one consistent thread that has come through this transition from the old Soviet Union to the new Russian Federation, it has been this affinity within Russian culture and history for a strong man, a strong leader, regardless of what it means to the prosperity of individual families and the climate for business. Does that still predominate Russian outlook in this day and age?
You know, I'd kind of like what you said, I'd really hesitate to make that sort of broad cultural comment, but I think that is a factor. I think, though, that when you look at how much Russia has opened up in recent years, and you look at all the traveling that young people are doing, and you look at some of the opposition, I think it's difficult really to make that argument as being the prevailing attitude in Russia.
Kim Iskyan, we appreciate your assessment from the Global Contrarian, and Francesca Page, we appreciate you joining us for this interview. Now, we invite you, wherever you're watching, to join us with your comments on the continued international hijinks by the Russian Federation and what it means to their economy. And perhaps I need to engage in self-editing. Hijinks? No, more like provocative actions outside the Russian borders. Why don't you tweet us your comments at Newsmax TV, #America's Forum. There's also email and Facebook. We'll be right back.